Hello everybody, welcome to the stream. It is 8 a.m. here in the morning and I am quite tired and I'm joined by Cameron in Australia. And what time is it there, Cameron?
5 p.m.
5 p.m. Amazing time zones.
Yeah.
How do they work? So Cam, you were actually my first podcast guest ever. Podcast / stream guest. I'm never really sure what to call it because we use it for multiple purposes. And you're back because you sent me a copy of your new book, The Great Housing Hijack, which I've read, and it's really, really, really good, and it's really interesting. There's a lot to discuss in it. So thanks so much for coming back.
Thanks for having me,
sending
mate.
me the book.
Yeah. No worries.
So I mean, you don't really take any prisoners in this thing. I think that's a fair way to summarize it. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, I think everyone cops a bit of honesty from my opinion on what sort of the vested interests that are sort of corrupting the debate. Even the academics who have a strong interest in getting paid to talk to each other and not really contribute to workable policy solutions. There's a lot of incentive in academia to go around in circles. So, yeah, they cop it. The Yimbys cop it. The press cops it. The lobby groups cop it. But at the end of the day, I hope that when you read it, you saw that I did try and tie a clear thread through and offer a coherent way to understand the housing market. Did you get that? Did it work?
Yeah. It's not just you relitigating arguments on Twitter, although it is that as well. But no, you present a framework, a clear framework. You spend some time detailing it, the 5 different housing market equilibria. So there's a solid theory underpinning what you're saying, and you go through evidence and case study, and you also offer a lot of solutions. It's just that I think a lot of your ideas and proposals put you directly squarely into conflict with all of these groups, right? And so that's why you're kind of forced to say that I don't think that they're being honest or their analysis isn't very good. I'll come back to the people who cop it in a bit, but let's start with the positive thing, because your framework is this 5 housing market equilibria, right? So obviously I don't think you're going to be able to detail all of the theories completely. There's a lot to take in there, but broadly, what's your thinking behind these, and where does it kind of fill the gap in the usual kind of analysis you see in housing?
Yeah. I probably could explain them all if you want. I don't know how much time we're going to have.
Oh, honestly, please.
The issue is this. There are certain economic forces at play in housing markets and all asset markets, right? If there is an arbitrage situation, buying low here and selling high there, that will get closed, right? That's one of the big insights of economics. A lot of the conversation around housing ignores some dimension where there is an arbitrage, right? So a lot of the conversation, for example, will be talking, if we allow property owners to build denser, they will also build faster, ignoring that there's an arbitrage between building today and building tomorrow. And every property owner is making that trade-off between, I don't want to build too many today because I've got to build some tomorrow. And the analogy I use is, it doesn't matter how many apples you've got in the fridge. You're going to eat them as a sequence over time, so that you're not going to eat 300 apples today, but you might eat 300 apples this year, one per day over the year, because you're trading off the benefit of having an extra apple today versus having one tomorrow. And that's true of property owners who build houses. So there's this dimension, and I call that the absorption rate, where there's a trade-off between building faster or building slower, which is sort of equivalent to building today or building tomorrow. And if you overlook some of these dimensions, so that's one of them, and there are 5, you're going to be sort of steered astray on your analysis, right? All of those conditions must be sort of factored in. So, for example, The first equilibrium is the asset price, right? The asset price of housing and of land. People will say, oh, well, house costs what the land and construction costs is, right? So if construction costs go up, house prices go up. It's not exactly true, right? Because the value of the land input is the result of the arbitrage in asset markets, right? So you can take your asset, your land, and combine it with another asset, cash, and pay for construction, and now end up with an asset called a developed home.
Mm.
And the equilibrium requires that the land value is always the residual of the developed home asset price minus the construction cost, right? Because that's the equilibrium. If it wasn't, the land would be too cheap and the property owner could build and sell and make an abnormal gain. And if it was the opposite, no one would pay that for the land. So the price of housing comes from the asset market, right? Because we can take cash and swap it from different assets back into housing. The price of land falls out of that as well. And I think a lot of people just they're not thinking economically when it comes to housing. Many of them are thinking in accounting terms of an individual, right? And ignoring the economic effects across the market. So I think, yeah, offering these five equilibria is really just forcing people to be economically coherent or consistent in their reasoning about housing. And it sort of forces me to do it as well, right? So, you've written books, you sort of write a book to test your own ideas and make yourself think logically and coherently. So that's probably sort of where it emerged from. But now there's a framework to sort of enforce in a conversation about housing economics some coherency.
Yeah, yeah. I do think that when you write a book, it's kind of probably mostly for yourself, isn't it? And hopefully other people find it useful, and not in a selfish way. It's about working out your ideas, right, and putting pen to paper. And I think you've done that. I mean, so let's just talk a little bit more about these equilibria, because I think, knowing you and knowing me, equilibrium can be a bit of a dirty word. We've both been very critical of like neoclassical economics in the past. So I suppose in a way I was a little bit surprised that you led with this equilibrium discussion. Now, I'd like you to sort of maybe defend that a bit.
Okay. Yeah, I think, one of the big insights in economics is that people optimize. Mm-hmm. And I think I would go even further. Okay, so let's get into the details here. Mm-hmm. These equilibria, I argue, are emergent market outcomes. So you might not be a rational individual actor in the market who builds at this optimal rate to smooth out the perfect intertemporal, optimization, or build at the perfect density to maximize the return on any particular project. You might not be a good optimizer. But what's a good optimizer? Markets. Because if you don't optimize, you make less money than the guy who gets closer to the optimum, right? And so you go broke. The organization that's better at making those trade-offs succeeds because they've made more money than you have, right? And over time, there is a pressure in the market to sort of converge. Now, I'm not saying it's always an equilibrium, but if you want to understand the market, ignoring that there is this pressure doesn't make sense. So the example I use in the book is the queue at the supermarket checkout, right? And I make the case that, well, if there's two supermarket checkouts and one has a queue of 2 people and one has a queue of 8 people, it's not an equilibrium because 3 of those people at the back can switch out of the 8 queue and into the 2 queue. Right? Because that trade is available, the market will automatically generate nearly an equilibrium. Not always, right? Some people will guess the wrong queue and it'll take too long. And so if I'm trying to understand supermarket checkout behavior as a policy question for how to design supermarkets, I have to acknowledge that when there's a queue, people are going to shuffle in so that all those queues are roughly equal length. And I can use length either in physical dimension, but probably in time, right? Because people will I've lost my sound.
Oh, you look.
People will shift,
Okay.
right? I'm going to just take these out.
Cameron
And
can't, Cameron can't hear me,
sorry, I'm just
everybody.
going to put my. There
If
we
you want
go.
to insult him, we can do it now. Oh no, he's back. Okay, so you can hear me now, right?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Yeah, yeah. So I think it, it was. Yeah, I was a little bit surprised knowing you to see this equilibrium, but I think it really worked, to be honest, with you.
Oh, thanks.
Because, like you say, you identify these tendencies. So there's the asset market, right? Equilibrium, which is like people getting arbitrage opportunities through the value of the investment in land housing. There's the absorption rate equilibrium, which is like the rate at which new housing is released to the market and how that's beneficial. There's a bunch of others, but I think you apply these kind of consistently. And I think for me, I don't know if you think that there's a most important one. Maybe they're all equally important, but for me the absorption rate equilibrium seemed to keep coming up, right? And so
Yeah.
I'd like to speak about that a little bit more, because I know while it's also, I was having a go at you for being abstract, that seems to come from your experience, right, as at working in property. I think that's
Yeah.
something you've seen, right? The rate at which housing is released into the market and land is released into the market is ignored in almost all discussion of housing apart from yours. I honestly think, as well as the internal documents of these property companies, they know about it, right? So could you speak to that, please?
Yeah.
Like what makes that so important for you?
No worries. Is my sound okay?
I think you sound fine. Yeah.
Okay, great. So, yeah, you're right. Probably, as you'd know, we've both critiqued some of the static models of economics because they ignore time, right? There's a short run, long run. I'm like, but where's the time dimension, right? Everything happens. There are flow rates per period of time, and there are levels of balances, but there's no short run, long run,
I remember
right?
one
That's
of
an
my professors
arbitrary.
being like, I was like, how long's the long run? And he was like, oh, I don't know, about 6 months. It's just like, where did you get that? Where did you get that from?
And the fact that you can have opposite effects in the short run and the long run
Yeah.
tells me we are really missing something. So I think my equilibrium approach is more saying I'm not going to arbitrarily do this. I'm going to look at time as a dimension itself, and I'm going to look at asset pricing as its own dimension, and I'm going to break down the problem. I'm not going to sort of trick us by dumping density and supply in the same graph, right? So, for example, a lot of the time, economists will say, well, more density, or, if there's a density limit in the planning rules, more density means more homes. And I'm like, but there's a difference between homes per land area in a project and homes per period of time across all potential projects,
Yes.
right? One is density, homes per land area, one is homes per period of time. And in fact, the homes per period of time is the product of density times projects, right? Dwellings per land area of a project time project land area per period of time. The dimensions cancel out and you're left with housing per period of time. And yet we confuse these dimensions in a lot of the conversation about housing supply, right? And so my experience working in property was actually people aren't in a hurry to build homes. They like making money, and once they're committed to certain contracts, they're really in a hurry because they're on the hook. But prior to committing to a construction contract, for example, you're not really in a hurry, because the difference between building your building today and building it in 5 years, it's not that different, right? The present value of that, on average, is likely to be the same. So yeah, my experience was we had a display suite open on a Saturday morning to sell off the plan apartments when I worked for a developer in Brisbane called FKP. And that was at the Sunshine Coast, so beautiful beachside part of Queensland. And there was a queue down the footpath on Saturday morning for people who wanted to buy these apartments. And so we'd underprice them. And it was true that those prices were profitable. But do you know what's more profitable? Putting the prices up and selling the same number of dwellings over a 5-year period instead of a 5-hour period. right? We could have sold them all that day, but we said, no, we're going to miss our one shot of making money. In fact, the arbitrage there is that the buyers queuing up are paying below market prices because we set our price schedule a few months earlier and the market was rocketing.
Mm.
And so those buyers could buy the whole building from us and turn around and resell them, right? If anyone had deep enough pockets, they could have bought the 80 apartments off us. They wouldn't have had to settle and then turned around and resold that contract in the market. And so we said, no, that's silly. We should get that value. So why don't we close the office, put the prices up, and then instead drip feed it out, getting the highest possible price each month for each dwelling. And when that building was finished, 2 years later, we still hadn't sold, the penthouse. There's 2 penthouses and a couple of the other buildings, right? I think the last one took 4 or 5 years to sell those final couple of apartments. But that was what was best. And if that's true for an individual property owner / developer, it's true for all property owners, right? No one's in the business of sort of making less money by going too quickly. So yeah, that one, you'll be surprised how long it took me to think this through. I'd seen it and I'm like, oh, but look at what happens. And then I looked out the window from the university when I was studying my PhD and I saw all this part of Brisbane that was upzoned for apartments. And I'm like, but where are they? Like, I'd look at them. They're not there. They've been upzoned for years. And I went around and I knocked on every door of all the academics in economics. I said, hey, people keep saying homes get built when it's profitable. But look out the window. There are like 10,000 profitable apartments that no one's started yet. And they might not, that was like, 12 years ago, and half of them are not built. Probably the majority of where you can build in the area you could see from the university is not built. And no one had a really good answer. And I got to the last door. They're like, oh, there must be a regulatory constraint, right? The default economics answer, if the market's not doing what you think it should or what seems right, then it couldn't be the market's problem, right? It must be the regulations problem because the market would, everyone would be happy with the market outcome, surely. And so they got to the last door knocking along the hallway in economics, and it was John Foster, professor, he's now retired. And he said, that's a really interesting question. You sound like you're thinking in terms of real options. You should read Dixit and Pindick's 1991 book called, whatever, I'll have to look it up quickly while we're here. The book is called Investment Under Uncertainty.
Yes, yes.
And it basically is like, when you have an irreversible investment, one-shot decision, the opportunity cost of building that today is actually what you give up the chance of building something different in the future, right? The opportunity cost is not how much money did it cost or what's the different design. It's actually a temporal trade-off. And that's what the absorption rate is all about, the trade-off on that time dimension. And it's quite interesting to me that all of their examples, so it's a 1994 book called Investment Under Uncertainty, all of their examples are really about property and buildings and big, expensive, irreversible investment. And it all makes a lot of sense. And yet, in the public conversation about housing, complete black hole. No one wants to talk about real options. No one wants to acknowledge the subtlety, right, involved in making these trade-offs in a market. And so the absorption rate is sort of my attempt to communicate the deep economic insight that they had for a more general audience in a more simplified way.
Yeah.
And I just say there's an intertemporal trade-off, right? And you don't want to eat tomorrow's lunch today, right? Because you won't get as much benefit. So you also don't want to build tomorrow's houses today either. It's kind of as simple as that. But it took me, 4 years of a PhD and probably 4 years after that to really articulate the idea and write a paper about it, because we're sort of trained not to think like that. That was really hard.
It's amazing, isn't it? Because, it's one of those things, and I've had this before, where it takes you 10 years, and then afterwards you're like, well, that's obvious. Like, why did it take me so long to think of that? Why, and also why did nobody else think of it before? Because it's just like, yeah, okay. And especially with land, I think, and housing, it's like people often speak about how land isn't the same as capital, and we've got to treat land differently. That's the kind of basic Georgist insight. And, sometimes it's not entirely clear what that means. But I think this waiting, right, because land is permanent, right? So this is the thing.
Correct.
You can sit on land until the cows come home, right? And that's probably why it's so salient, this waiting. And people talk about land banking, right? People talk about holding on to unused land. There's been a lot about that in the UK over the past couple of years, people complaining about it. And yeah, it's such a fundamental insight. And it also completely belies a lot of the standard narratives I think you hear about housing policy.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like it's now my job because I've jumped those intellectual hoops of trying to think a different thought that's sort of not been thought about before. And I feel like it's my duty now to spread this insight a little bit. So I've the last few weeks at Fresh Economic Thinking, which is my new one-man think tank, I've been trying to sort of piece by piece articulate some of these insights. I've got a couple of academic papers as well. But, it's interesting because in the UK, this land banking issue has been around since the 2000s boom, right? There are at least 3 inquiries, the last one being, I think, the Letwin Review into the rate of home building, or what they call the build-out rate. And they kept saying, oh, why aren't we building faster? The planning system's sort of trying to, allow for this, or to foster these homes, but developers, are sort of pacing themselves. And so there was at least 3 parliamentary reviews in the UK about this problem, and they never quite jumped that sort of intellectual hurdle around maybe the static model that doesn't have time in it that you're trying to apply is the wrong one for thinking about a trade-off, an intertemporal trade-off. And in fact, I got a call from, it was called the Department of Innovation, or it had a funny name. The UK, it was like Department of New Ideas and Innovation. It was a random thing. They called me on the phone. I don't know how they got my number.
That's such a funny department. I love those department names. Just Department of Good Things and Better Policy.
Yeah. And they said, we've been tasked with finding examples around the world where cities have just deregulated the planning system and got cheap houses. And we've called a bunch of people and they didn't know. And someone said to call you. And I said, well, I don't know either. Maybe the reason is there aren't any examples, right? Maybe it's so hard for you to find because there aren't any. And this was years after the Letwin Review, which was years after the Barker Review, I think was the one before that, which was years after the previous one in the early 2000s. So it's this big sort of, some people would say it was written out of economics, this sort of the big insight that you get from sort of land economics, that land lasts forever, so there's no rush to build. People say that got sort of intentionally painted out of economics at the turn of the 20th century. Don't know how much merit there is to that, but it seems to have been the net result. But my point is, if you keep going back in time, you'll see the same issue come up every cycle, because the property market moves in cycles. There's 5 big cycles in the 1800s. And it was the biggest sort of political economy topic of why does capitalism boom and bust, right? It's a problem. And, that was intrinsically tied to land and land prices and the price cycle and the construction cycle on land. And anyway, the point I'm trying to get to is you can just keep going back in time and we keep having the same conversation. So, for example, you can go back to 1911 and New South Wales had its first inquiry into the rental prices in Sydney, right? And we had our first fair rental laws in 1915. You can go back to the sort of 1880s land boom in Victoria and all the issues that came up then. And in fact, you can go way back to 1836, right? And you've got to understand, the British only discovered Australia in 1770, right? And their first fleet came in 1788. So literally there's not a single white guy who has thought about housing markets until really the 1800s. And I think the first property title was like in 1815 or something in New South Wales, right? So this is very early days. But when Charles Darwin, father of evolutionary biology, visited Sydney in 1836 on the HMS Beagle on his tour around the world, the first thing he noted in his diary on his first day was not kangaroos and koalas, was the fact that people in Sydney complain about housing. I think I've memorized the quote. He wrote, "The number of homes recently built is truly surprising. Nevertheless, everyone complains of the high rents and difficulty in procuring a house." Right? 1836,
Yeah.
population of Sydney, 19,000. Was it the town planning regulations? Was it the income taxes? What was it? Because we didn't have any of that, right? So this same conversation, we've had it continuously, basically for 200 years.
This is how you open the book, right? You talk about all of this, and it is just amazing how it's just the same. The debate's just the same for 200 years.
I do find it amazing, and I think that's why it's called the Great Housing Hijack, right? I feel like the debate is constantly just hijacked, right? There's so little. I'm not saying housing, the market is hijacked, but the conversation and the way we talk about it and our understanding is certainly hijacked. Because I would have thought if you'd thought hard about something for 200 years that's really important, you'd sort of know quite a lot. But I don't see much new today compared to when Charles Darwin was talking about it, or even the 1911 sort of fair rents review in Sydney. And and so I talk about in the book all the different interest groups, property owners, the media, how really there's not really an incentive to understand this better. There's an incentive to sell newspapers. There's an incentive to get grants. There's an incentive to get rules rewritten in your favor if you're a property owner. Get infrastructure built to your area, not someone else's. And so this is my attempt to just draw a line and say, here's what I think the best current understanding is, and here's why I think the debate's hijacked by lots of different interest groups.
I've been reading Friedrich Engels, the condition of the working class in England, and a lot of that is about housing conditions, right? It's just it's just the same stuff that comes up again and again. And I think there was one of the quotes that stuck out to me was it Truman? Harry Truman, who said, Harry Truman?
Yeah.
He said about the property lobby, I think it was after World War II, when the US was making some attempt at building public housing, which I think was like limited success because they don't really do public over there. But he said that he basically just sort of channeled your book as far as I was aware. He was sort of went forward in time, read your book and came back and expressed it.
That's right. So, the attempts after the war to enact some decent public housing in the US were sort of thwarted because the landlord lobby said, you're going to steal our customers. You're going to give people a cheaper option, bring down the price of our housing. That is just, this is not on, right? Meanwhile, no doubt back then, just like today, the property industry itself is saying, no, if you deregulate us, we'll compete with each other to get that outcome. Trust me.
Yeah.
Right. So we've just had this. So I can I'll quote the Truman thing out of the book here. He writes, his speech in 1989 says, "I've been shocked in recent days at the extraordinary propaganda campaign that has been unleashed against this bill," which is the Housing Act of 1949, "by the real estate lobby. I do not recall ever having witnessed a more deliberate campaign of misrepresentation and distortion against legislation of such crucial importance to the public welfare. The propaganda of the real estate lobby consistently misrepresents what will be the actual effect of the bill and consistently distorts the facts of the housing situation in the country." And, I'm just going to borrow that, right? Whenever there's a new housing bill proposed today, just go, hey, Truman had it right.
Yeah. Yeah. Can we talk a bit more about these lobbies then? Because I do think it's quite important, and it's kind of amazing the contradictions, right? And I think you highlight a lot of the contradictions because they're sort of saying one thing but really doing another, right? And there's this idea that deregulation will just deliver all the housing we need and lower prices. But obviously that would be bad for them, right?
Yeah.
If it really lowered prices, right? So they wouldn't lobby for it.
Yeah.
Right.
So let me just restate what you've just said.
Yeah.
They're saying you deregulate us, we will compete with each other to make prices lower. Now, which industries lobby for more competitors?
Mm.
None, right? Taxi industry hated Uber. Farmers want import controls.
Yeah.
Pharmacists want regulations to protect themselves from supermarkets distributing drugs. Property industry, no, they're the opposite. No. They want more competition
They love us.
and lower price. I mean, come on.
Mm.
Yeah, so that's a classic one, and I feel like I actually had a bit of success. We had one of dozens and dozens of parliamentary reviews. I think this one was a Senate inquiry. I think about 4 years ago, and the senator who started it, Jason Falinsky, he's actually he's a pretty good guy. He's pretty switched on. I said, okay, I'm telling you, property owners are not going to flood the market just because they're allowed to. Because do you know what? They're already allowed to, right? There are major developers in Australia. I did a study showing they had something like 45,000 existing housing lots on their books already, and they were only selling like 1 or 2,000 per year. It was an astronomical figure because they're pacing themselves, right? And I asked Jason Falinsky, the senator, I said, go and get these guys. You've got the power to force them to come in under oath and answer your questions, right? So ask them, is it better for you to have lower house prices or not financially? And he did. And they said, no. That's no good for us if prices come down. And I'm like, thank you. Finally, you're on the record. And then he goes, oh, well, if we upzoned everywhere, would we reverse the 20% price increase we saw last year? And they're like, no, the effect wouldn't be anything like that. And I'm like, and yet here we are. The fundamental premise of this whole inquiry is that the opposite is true. And it's quite interesting because they then sort of turned around and go, oh, no, the price would rise slower than otherwise.
Mm.
I'm like, that is a price decline, right? If the rate of growth is lower than otherwise, then it's a decline, right?
Yeah.
You can't just sort of bail yourself out from your initial gut reaction that it's not going to do anything. But no, rate of growth, there'll be a tendency for the market to, do. I'm like, sorry, guys.
We just don't see house price declines, really, do we? And I think this is another thing that you highlight quite well, right? It's the what you call the symmetry of the housing market. This phrase comes up again and again in the book as well, I think. And it's just that, yeah. So firstly, we don't see house price declines, really. We might temporarily, obviously in a crash, you see it. But I mean, that's the clue, right? That's considered a bad thing, right? But then also it's a bad thing when house prices rise, right? And so it's like it just feels like we're trapped, and like anything that happens in the housing market can be both good and bad, and you find plenty of examples of the media covering the same event from that angle, right? And yeah, I suppose so. I mean, you can speak a bit to that. I suppose what would you like to see, or how do you view it? What would you like to see happen in the housing market? What would actually be the good outcome overall?
Yeah, well, that's right. So the symmetry is this: if you own property, you make money from high rents and the value of property going up. If you don't own property, the rent is a pure cost to you, and the price of buying is a pure cost. So there's this sort of fundamental symmetry, and I think Henry George was pretty right on that. It's like, well, if you own property, if it's kind of a socially privileged thing, you should be taxed on that, right? And then we should sort of distribute that wealth and circulate it around. But yeah, this is the sort of fundamental point, right? The $60 billion it costs renters to rent their 3 million homes in Australia each year. That's not a macroeconomic cost. It's a transfer because it's actually the income of Australia's 2 million landlords, right? So if we for somehow orchestrated rents to come down 10%, that's $6 billion of income. We're basically saying, landlords, sorry, you're going to be $6 billion per year less income. And do you know what? Because of that, the value of your $3 trillion of homes might only be worth 2.7 trillion. Sorry. Right. So I think the trick is the asset pricing in the market is sort of going to do what it's going to do. It's going to go in cycles. It's going to reflect prevailing monetary policy settings. And I think we often ignore this, and I might return to it in a minute.
Mm.
And if we look historically, the good things we got from housing were when we just subsidized people who didn't own homes into homes. That's it. I like if I could find really good housing outcomes somewhere where that wasn't true, I would say let's do that. But do you know what? Wealthy cities of the world that have secure, affordable housing usually have very large social housing sectors. That is basically the tenant is has regulated access to a home below the market price. And that's equivalent to a subsidy, right? Because the owner of the property could rent it at the market price. But however we institutionalize this is renting at a below market price, giving up that gap. The history of Australia, getting home ownership from like 43% prior to the Second World War to 71% in 1971. We subsidized people into homes. We subsidized home lending for non-home owners. We subsidized purchasing of former public homes. So there was like a rent to buy option. And we got hundreds and hundreds of thousands of households off rent and into home ownership. And do you know what? The benefit of that still exists today. Like people are still living in these homes today and have had that subsidized 50 years of housing. So that's sort of where I end up. And there's this sort of, I probably don't dwell on it much in the book, but there's this sort of, would you rather wipe trillions off everybody's home value? Or would you rather just subsidize a small sliver of non-homeowners into home ownership, or subsidize them into rental at a far, far lower cost, right? Because 67% of people own their own home, right? Probably half the private renters are doing pretty well. They're highly mobile. They're not going to want to stay put in a subsidized home. So you're up at like 80% of households, right? Are fine how it is. So I think better than picking a fight with them and trying to wipe trillions of value off their balance sheet through orchestrating whatever, just subsidize the small sliver who are missing out, right? Just like we used to come up with a reasonably fair system. I proposed in the book, copy Singapore, right, which is a subsidized home ownership type of scheme, but it sort of limits how much gain you get because you have to resell into this parallel market. You can't just sell to any old, wealthy foreign billionaire or whatever. I've proposed that. But unless we're sort of talking that way, I feel like we don't really want to do anything, right? I think we're sort of tricking ourselves that there's some kind of win-win that avoids this symmetry. Houses will get cheaper and it won't wipe trillions of value off everyone's home or billions of income from the landlords. And they'll be fine with it. Like how, right? So that's sort of where I end up. It's a tricky puzzle. And if you look historically, that's why the post-World War II period, and even the post-World War I period in many places, which was sort of the first round of subsidized soldier housing in Australia, that was relatively successful for changing the sort of status quo in the housing market.
Yeah, so I mean, this is what you call it, housemate, I think, in a very, very Aussie name. But you're sort of, I mean, so you're talking about subsidies then, and forgive me if I'm just a bit confused. Also, there was a bit of chaos in chat, so I had to do some moderation. But when you're talking about subsidizing, sometimes, and I'm sure you say this, like people say that subsidies to tenants can just sort of go straight to landlords and they don't necessarily help. But you're talking about basically subsidizing the housing itself and giving the housing itself away at low cost, right? Which is a bit different to that. Have I got that right?
Yeah, correct. So it's not like cash payments to renters that adds to their income and lets them compete more with each other, and a portion of that goes to higher rents. I'm not against giving low income households more money. That's totally fine. But, we do have a modern welfare state in Australia, and poor households do get supported with their, monetary incomes. And you know what? They still have to compete in the market, right? So if your city is growing, the rents are growing really fast, but your income's not, you're going to get left behind, even if you're supported financially, because just these other unequal trajectories in the market. So I think, providing the home provides the security and the subsidy that can't get sort of passed on. And I feel like that's a sort of important ingredient, right? Participating in the provision of housing, not just in the provision of money for people to then go and, again, keep competing in the private market. And here's the funny thing, right? In Australia, buying a home is considered the best thing ever to leverage into. Literally, I have this saying, Treasury has a magic suit. They put on their suit and they go to work in Treasury and they say, oh, houses, that's a real expensive cost. If the state's going to build houses and own them, wouldn't want to do that. It's going to cost the Treasury. Come home, take your suit off, get on the phone to your mortgage broker. Can I have another $1 million for a house in Sydney? It's the best investment you can make. Nothing beats it.
Yeah.
Which is it? Is it the biggest cost imposition on the Treasury, or is it the greatest investment you can make in the country? Can't be both, right? And I think we've got to think about, well, why, we build and run public schools, public hospitals, public roads, public parks. No one says, oh, we shouldn't have parks. Rich people can afford backyards. We should have an income subsidy and we should only have private parks. And people can then compete if they want to go and walk outside to bid access to the nicest places. I mean, no one says that. But housing is sort of special in our minds. And we think that that's true. Whereas if you participate in the production side, the balance sheet of the Treasury will rise because housing is still an asset that goes up in value. So, for example, the Land and Housing Commission in New South Wales owns the stock of public housing. In 2012, its housing was worth something like $34 billion, right? In 2019, its housing was worth $52 billion. That's $18 billion it made for doing nothing but providing public housing.
Yeah.
Now, you people go, well, that's not real money. That's just on your balance sheet. I'm like, what do you think your investment fund is? It's just something on your balance sheet. It's not real money till you sell it either. Your Vanguard fund, you've got to sell it to make it, but you still think it's real money. Should be real money for anyone else as well. And we know it is because we have this crazy situation in Australia, in Queensland, where I'm from. We had the Commonwealth Games in 2018 and the state said, oh, we're not going to build the Athletes Village. What a waste of money building houses, right? Because it was going to be the Athletes Village for 2 weeks, then build to rent housing. They said, we'll get a private investor to fund this. That's the way we should do it. So they organized everything, right? They organized the infrastructure. They gave the land as part of the deal and said, you can build, something suitable here. We'll give you the land as long as you build it before 2018 and let us use it for the Commonwealth Games. And they did. And it's been, pretty successful. It's been rented the last few years. But what I find really interesting is who this private investor was. It was the Abu Dhabi Investment Council. It was an investment fund from a foreign government who thought, you know what's a good thing to do with our money? Build houses in Australia.
Yeah.
And you know what our government said? You know what's the worst thing to do with our money? Build houses in Australia. It's crazy. So I think this symmetry point should help allay concerns about public involvement in the provision of housing because there's a symmetry there, right? You still get the asset, the gain from the asset. It's not a pure cost. The subsidy gap is a cost, but not the whole construction cost. I think does that make sense?
Yeah. I think it does, and it's a common thing I find with discussions of public versus private sector. People do often fail to include the assets of the public sector. It's sort of when people talk about privatization, and our previous government did this a lot, right? You sell things off and you get the money. But it's like, you've just lost an asset, right? And this is what you're saying for housing. It's like, why don't you? Yeah, like literally, just that you've lost an asset of the value of the money that you got for it, right? So, and sometimes under in the case of our government. It's just it is weird. People don't think about the assets of the country, the government, however you want to think about it. When they build something, when they do something, it does count, but for some reason it only is thought of as counting in the private sector.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, I'll give you a really crazy example.
Mm.
The Queensland government decided, that's the state where I live, where Brisbane is, decided that we're going to have an investment fund, right? Because, states should have investment funds, whatever. And they also said, oh, we're going to privatize the land titles office because they make a lot of money charging fees to, access the data and the land titles. So we're going to sell the land titles office. Oh, what's a good investment for our fund? Oh, the land titles office. So they literally sold the land titles office to their own investment fund, and somehow realized, the bottom line sort of balance sheet. The balance sheet went from zero. The land titles office is not worth anything if it's a government department, but now it's not. It's a private entity fully owned by a government investment fund. Now it's worth $7 billion. I don't know what the number is. Sorry, I just made that up. But I'm like, but that's just magic, right? It was also worth $7 billion before. You just pretended it wasn't. Right.
Let's talk a bit about macro policy and like inflation targeting, because you talk about this in the book, right? And I think you were just hinting at it earlier, and it relates to how we think about all this, because you say, here's the quote: "We have designed our macroeconomic stabilization policy as an insurance system for the housing market." Right. So I completely agree with this quote, but could you explain it to everyone?
Yeah. So basically, we've sort of decided collectively in the West that since the early 90s, the only way to attempt to stabilize the macroeconomy is to manipulate the overnight cash rate at the central bank and hope that all the other interest rates, because of these arbitrage, right, opportunities in interest rate markets, flow through. But the main effect of that is to manipulate the mortgage rate that mortgagees pay, right? Mortgagors pay, sorry. So, for example, Australia has something like $2 trillion of mortgages, and currently we're paying about 5 or 6% on that. But if the economy was going to do bad, right, we would drop the interest rates, and then we'd only be paying, instead of 5% of 2 trillion, we might be paying 2% of 2 trillion. And at the same time, the lower mortgage rate means, well, this asset that's earning the same rent is probably worth more now, right? Because I can borrow at 2%, right, and buy this asset that's now returning 5%. Right. So people are going to do that. They're going to borrow and they're going to arbitrage that asset. And so, we've got this strange situation like during COVID, pretty unusual sort of economic disruption. But what did we do? We subsidized homeowners, right? In Australia, we gave away more than $10 billion in subsidies to do home renovations. We dropped interest rates. So we saved mortgagors hundreds of billions of dollars in interest. And at the same time, that led to rising asset prices of housing, right? Because the asset price is somewhat inverse to the capitalization rate or the interest rate. And that happened globally. We had a huge housing boom because of our sort of attempts to stabilize the economy during COVID. The good thing, though, the flip side of that is that the independent central banks do seem to really care about inflation and try and reverse that, right? So the last couple of years, we've seen interest rates go back up globally in an attempt to make house prices lower and in an attempt to make people build fewer homes. Because you know what's bad for inflation? Everyone trying to build a home at the same time, right? So there is some, there's some value from the independence of central banks to actually push against that. And right, that politically people are like, no, high interest rates are bad for us. Please don't do that. But because the central banks are independent, they did it. However, now we got that outcome, right? Construction's falling in a lot of places. House prices are falling. You can see it in New Zealand and Canada. I think in the UK. So what are we doing? We're like, sorry, guys, we actually need higher house prices again. That's the only thing that's going to save the economy from here. So it's a really bizarre sort of situation. I don't know how many better alternatives there are, but there are people out there now buying houses expecting the mortgage rate to fall in the next couple of years and the price to rise consequentially, right? Consequently.
Mm.
So yeah, that's sort of how it works, right? If prices fall too much, we lower interest rates to get prices up again. That's the sort of insurance part of it. And at the same time, um, the lower interest rate sort of bails you out with your mortgage because you can refinance at a lower rate.
Mm.
Um,
It's interesting that that's kind of it, it's actually kind of how monetary policy works. It's like the main way that the interest rate channel works, and I feel like
mm,
there's not enough. You know, say you open an economics textbook and you get the sort of interest rate policy. There's this idea that people are what you said earlier, that intertemporal maximizers, but literally, and it's sort of affecting everything. There's not
yeah,
really a direct acknowledgement that actually the mortgage channel, partly because
yeah,
mortgages are literally fixed to the base rate, right? That is the channel, right? The main channel through which, it's not the only one, but it's the main channel through which monetary policy operates, right? And
yep,
I think that just speaks to how what the big role that we've had housing play in our economy, right? Which you were just describing. It's just
yeah,
like it just seems to be connected to everything, right? It's connected to our monetary policy, our macroeconomic stabilization. It's a lot of
yeah,
people's form of like insurance and their pension,
yep.
effectively. And it seems to be just playing this outsized role in the economy, and when perhaps it really shouldn't. Perhaps we should find other ways of, we should have different levers that don't all go through housing.
Yeah, look, it's hard to know.
Mm,
It's hard to stop people spending money on houses if that's where you want to spend money on, right? Like we're
mm,
richer than ever. Why shouldn't we spend more on bigger houses or living in a better location? Um, but yeah, you're right that it's sort of got this outsized political influence for
mm,
sure. Um, I'll grant you that. And let me just quickly touch on the mortgage transmission channel. I think the reason it doesn't have such large effects in other asset markets is because the other asset markets risk is such a big element, right? Like your house is not going to be worth zero, but most companies could be worth zero in the next 10 years,
mm.
right? So risk is very much higher. And so the
Yeah.
interest rate change is a small share of the risk buffer in other asset markets. But in housing, the interest rate change is a very large share, and we can also leverage a lot into housing. So the effect is going to be sort of scaled up in a low risk, high leverage market like housing and scaled down in other asset markets where risk is higher and there's less ability to leverage in. So that's why, the simple macro story is this changes intertemporal decisions evenly. The practice is that it changes mostly housing because the effect is so much relative. The effect is relatively large
Mm,
compared to the risk in housing and our ability to leverage into it. And for lots of other business capital investment, the effect is really small because it's much bigger than consideration than the interest rate, the risk that it's actually a good investment and that there's a market for, expanding my business.
mm.
And so the interest rate effect is a small proportion. So I think that's the logic. Now, I don't know how you make housing less important. So let me just
No,
sort of
I don't actually have any ideas there either, to be
well,
honest.
here's the question I have, and maybe
Yeah.
this will help get us into this more deeply. So the second equilibrium I talk about in the book is the rental price equilibrium. So there's a lot of discussion in housing markets of rents should be lower, right? The question is, well, what should they be? Right?
Mm,
Where do rents come from? Right? Because the only reason you have to pay this rent is because someone else was willing to pay the same rent, right? You're only outbidding other renters. And every renter in the market is making a decision. Should I spend more on housing, on a better location or a bigger house or fewer people per home? Or should I spend my money on something else, something else in my consumer basket? And what you find interesting, and this is, the more I look into it, the more sort of unbelievable it is. The share of income spent on housing in Australia was 20% in 1990 for renter households. Okay. This is the income of renter households compared to the rent paid by renter households. It was 20% in 1991, was 20% in 2001. It was 20% in 2011. It was 20% in 2021. In that 1911 New South Wales housing inquiry, it was pretty close to 20% too. Why is it this sort of fixed budget share, right? If you go to Canada, it's literally a flat line for the last 30 years, the share of renter income spent on rent. And I think that is sort of this trade-off that we make. Like if rents get too high, we go, oh, well, we'd rather have other goods and services. So I'll consolidate my home or I'll move to a smaller home. And there's these adjustment mechanisms in the market to bring us back to that point. So a lot of what's happened during COVID and why there's been a global rental surge is not because suddenly we lost too many houses and we had the right number of houses in 2019, but then all of a sudden we had the wrong number of homes and, we didn't build enough. So everyone's income went up, not everyone's income. The whole distribution went up, but unevenly. And so some people who are at the top of that, or not the top of the distribution, but the top of the growth rate of the distribution, those people could go, hey, now I've got heaps of income. I could buy a new Toyota, or I could move to a better location or a bigger house. But some people's income didn't grow, right? And they, just to stay put, were like, hang on a minute, why do I have to pay an extra, $400 a month to stay where I am? Well, that's because other people's incomes are growing and they're trying to upgrade into your suburb and so on and so forth. So it's mostly an income story, which is why rents spiked and have started coming down, for example, in the US. And now in Australia, there's essentially been no growth in asking rents since the start of this year. And I think in the UK, it's coming off as well.
I do feel obliged to mention that this brings us to your correct prediction, right? Which you mentioned in the book, right? Because you over COVID or after COVID, because you were, so just to make it very clear to everybody, an economist making a correct prediction about the future is pretty rare, and even more so, I think, sometimes people make a correct prediction, but you're not really sure where they got it from. So you wonder if they were just lucky. But clearly this followed from your framework, right? So, I mean, this partly relates to what you were just saying. But could you talk us through this? Because for me, seeing that you made a correct prediction about what was going to happen in the housing market, regardless of where I might nitpick about the use of equilibrium or whatever, that kind of made me think, well, surely you're onto something, right?
Thanks. Yeah, I think you're totally right. You should hold people to their predictions. My worst one was underestimating the inflation pulse, but the fact that it was a temporary global pulse was right. Just it was kind of bit longer and a bit bigger than I expected.
I think I was similar on that. I thought it was transitory, but it didn't end. It went higher and didn't end as quickly as I thought.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think I underestimated the scale of the stimulus early on, and I've since done calculations of the amount of stimulus we pumped into the economy in Australia and elsewhere, and that was an error. The correct prediction was in May 2020. So this is very early in COVID. The world's locked down. Everyone thinks it's going to be the next Great Recession, Great Depression, whatever we want. And the banks in Australia were forecasting house prices to fall 30% nominally, right? And they're like, oh, God, what if house prices fall 30%? We're going to need a bailout, basically, right? And so there's all this discussion of house prices falling 30%. And I did a podcast on the 8th of May 2020, and I said, hey, it was called Bull versus Bear Housing Debate or something. And I said, look, here are all the reasons I think prices will go up. Firstly, historically, house prices aren't correlated with unemployment because people who are nearly unemployed aren't in the market for buying houses. So it's, there's no evidence historically there. Secondly, we've just made the price to rent money drop from sort of 4% to 2%. We've halved the price of money. So we could double the price of houses and still have the same sort of cost of borrowing. And I said, even if rents fall 10 or 15%, the size of this asset repricing effect is so much bigger that prices are much more likely to rise 20% than fall 20%. And the essential reasoning is the asset pricing effect is so much bigger than the potential decline in nominal rents. The asset pricing effect being from the lower interest rates. And of course, People said, where'd this guy get his economics degree? Back of a cornflakes packet, all the rest of
I
it.
like I, like I like that. I like that one. I get similar things as well.
Yeah. And what's hilarious about that is like 2 years later, someone who follows me on Twitter found all these replies and responses all over the internet on
Mm.
Reddit and on Twitter and just wrote underneath all of them, "You were wrong, Cameron was right." And I'm like, who is this? Some random, it wasn't you, was it? But
Yeah,
no,
yeah, yeah.
some
Yeah,
didn't even know.
Cameron's trying to pretend that he's not doing an Elon Musk and that wasn't just like him under a different
Ah,
name.
no, because he started mentioning me on Twitter. I'm like, what is going on? Because I couldn't find it. I really wanted to find all these things, right?
Yeah,
To sort of, people telling me, new predictions saying, oh, what do you know? And I'm like, oh, I gotta go find my old prediction.
yeah, yeah.
So look, it's pretty funny. The problem now is I don't really know what's going to happen. I suspect we'll have a bit of a building construction surge in the next couple of years in Australia. We've just had a big decline, and after it goes down, it usually goes up. So there's my logic.
Mm.
Interest rates are starting to go down in a lot of countries, and there's the pretty good historical correlation with declining interest rates and rising housing construction in Australia.
Hmm.
Um, but price wise and nominally, and how much more inflation there is, or how central banks are going to react, no idea, unfortunately.
Yeah, I wouldn't feel there's so much political stuff as well. I think with the US election and how significant that might be for the world, I wouldn't really feel very confident making a prediction about the global economy, the UK economy, the Australian, the US, whatever. At the moment, I have no idea.
Yeah, there's just no one thing that's like clearly dominant and
Mm,
sort of being like, oh, even if there's a few other things, this is the main thing
mm,
that's going to happen. I can't even tell you that, right? Um, I do feel like a lot of people are expecting a huge house price correction, and I think it's going to be more narrow than many expect. Partly because we'll have fairly proactive monetary policy, but look, in Canada, there's already been a correction, and I think it's mostly over. New Zealand's already had a correction. Australia, not so much, but yields aren't particularly low in many cities, so there might be more of a correction in some cities like Brisbane and Adelaide, but less in Melbourne and Sydney.
so do you
Uh,
think this might be a bit simplistic in a way, but do you think that Australia is in a housing bubble?
yeah,
Because people have been saying
I
it
don't
for
think
forever, right?
20 years. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, I would say I'm not going to buy a house right now.
Okay. All right. All
Okay,
right.
but in 2019, so in line with my 2020 prediction, 2019, I had an investment property. I sold it to buy a bigger place for us to live in. And I was like, this is the best time to buy a house for 20 years. I've got to buy a house. Didn't have time to buy a house before COVID.
Mm,
So now during 2020, I'm like, oh, come on.
mm,
So basically rushed in and bought a house because I'm like, oh, it's now or never. Um,
mm.
so I did think it was a good time to buy then. I don't think it is now. But the degree to which it's a bubble is really, it's a relative thing. It's not really a nominal thing, right? Because we can bail out a bubble by putting interest rates to zero again,
Mm.
right? And now a price with a 5% gross yield, which is like the 5% of the asset price you get as rent per year, gross, minus some management and maintenance and everything, might be 3.5%, 4%. Well, if you can start borrowing money at 2% again and getting 3 or 4% net after all
Mm.
your costs, it's just free money until the price goes up. So this is
Yeah.
that asset arbitrage again. So I suspect it's not as overpriced as a lot of people think right now. I think it's actually a slightly smaller boom in relative terms than the 2000s boom, which was a bit
No.
bigger and longer.
Yeah. Yeah. I think people are a bit scarred by the global financial crisis, right? I mean, you and I both kind of know Steve Keen, and
Yeah.
he's sort of been predicting, well, been saying there's a housing bubble for a while, or he did. I don't know what he's saying right now about it, actually. But I think the GFC because of all of the associated financial fraud, perhaps.
Yeah.
It was much bigger, and maybe there was a housing bubble then, and maybe there is. If there was one then, maybe there's something similar now. But if there isn't
Yeah.
that complex web of financial instruments and all that speculation, and it hasn't spread across the globe in the same way, then maybe it's not something to worry about as a first order consideration. Maybe we're sort of fighting the last war.
I think so. I think housing's not where the main financial risks are. And I say that for a few reasons. If you look at the US, since the financial crisis, mortgages have been paid down a lot, right? There was a lot of clearing out of debts in the decade after the financial crisis. And it's also true that the few COVID years where interest rates were dropped really low allowed a lot of people to accelerate repayments of mortgages. So anyone who actually bought before COVID is so far ahead that they've got this huge buffer.
Yeah.
So it's only people who've sort of bought in 2022, maybe a bit of 2021, who haven't seen their nominal incomes grow, who really relied on the super low interest rates, who are now paying 3 times as much for their mortgage. It's really a small pool of people. And in fact, what we've seen in Australia is the number of resales within 2 years hit quite a high last year and the first 6 months of this year. So a lot of people have already got out. So those high risk people that bought a couple of years ago that couldn't afford the mortgage have already sold. So I think those are sort of an accumulation of factors that make me think, yeah, okay, maybe nominal prices might be flat. Maybe they'll fall 10 or 15%, or even 20 or 30% in some cities and towns that were super inflated, like the coastal towns of Australia, right, where prices went up 50% just because everyone wanted to get out of the city during COVID. Probably their relative value should return to normal.
Right.
So if the cities fall 10%, they need to fall 30%, right? But I really, there's still a lot of nominal wage growth happening in Australia. So I think in real terms, the correction has begun. But because there's a bit of inflation around, it's sort of hiding behind the nominal flatness of the prices. So that's sort of where I'm at. I don't think it's a GFC-sized bubble or anything like that.
There'll be adjustments, right? And, obviously it'll be bad for some people and there'll need to be policy responses, but that doesn't mean that we're looking at a kind of implosion in Australia, let alone across the rest of the world.
No, and I really don't think so. And yeah, as I said, I expect construction to pick up and there to be relatively mild. Well, New Zealand's in a recession, right? Canada's sort of in a recession. UK's in a recession. Like
the UK has been basically in a recession for about 15 years. We're used to it.
Yeah. But in terms of this current depression, like the current trend, I think we're about halfway through in a lot of areas. I don't think there's a huge, maybe there'll be a bit of a stock market correction again and a little bit of, the sky is falling. But I just don't see a financial crisis scale event. I think there are overpriced cities that will correct a lot in Canada and Australia and some areas of the UK. But a lot of that correction will be in real terms because nominal wages are still rising. And so that sort of, we've got the end of this inflation pulse still to finish off.
Yeah, exactly. Let's return to a few of the people who cop it, but not just people who cop it, but I just want to discuss a few case studies, a few policy issues with you that we haven't discussed yet. Have you got time?
Yeah.
You're looking. I just saw your eyes.
I just
like the eyes
put
of a
my
man
do
who's
not
seen a
disturb
meeting.
on there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one of them that we didn't actually cover, which I found just really, really depressing, actually, was this letter somebody who worked in a homeless charity sent to you about how it's one thing for us to say property developers, they're not putting the interests of the people at heart. Like, okay, that's bad, but it's not shocking, right? We all know that. We've got that priced in, evil capitalists and so on. But the homelessness charity, I sort of had this growing sense of dismay as I read that section of the book. It's just horrible.
Oh, look, Yeah, okay. So I'll share you that story, and then maybe we can add the sort of academia a little bit.
Yes, let's.
Sort of dobbing myself in a little there.
Sure.
Um, but the book is an attempt to sort of cut through and improve things, so that's okay. So it was a phone call actually, and I can't remember the lady's name, but she got my number from someone, and I'd previously written a book. So my first book, Game of Mates, it's been republished as Rigged: How Networks of Mates Rip Off Everyday Australians. It's about grey corruption and political influence, right?
It's really good, and I preferred Game of Mates, but I don't know, rebranding.
I don't know. So that was self-published as Game of Mates,
Right,
and then the
right.
publisher was like, "Oh yeah, well, we're gonna have to change the title and blah blah blah." I don't care. Just
Whatever.
pay me some money so I can rewrite it. In fact, I said no at first. I'm like, I don't want to revisit that, but it has been good because they published the next book, and
Yeah,
they're
yeah.
very happy. So anyway, and there's a funny thing, right? It's a credibility game. Oh, you got a fancy publisher, therefore you must be smart. I'm like, oh, yeah, I'm not sure if that's how it works actually, but thanks.
The amount of books that are published by top publishers that are absolute nonsense will astound you. So, like,
Yeah.
honestly, it's not really that much of a sign of credibility.
It's one of those things that insiders know, but it still seems to have some signaling value.
Yeah, absolutely,
Um,
absolutely.
Anyway, so let's go to I got this call. The lady basically said, "I've just read your book about political favoritism and all this, the way networks of favors emerge over time, right?" And she's like, "I think you, I don't know who to talk to, but I think you'll understand. I work at a homelessness charity, and it was all great, but I've come to realize they don't want to end homelessness because it'll put them out of a job."
Mm.
And there is a sort of status thing to being this caring, we're the caring people, look at us with the homelessness charity. Well, you need homeless people, right? It's like the pharmaceuticals, right? We know that we know there's a military industrial complex, right? No point being a missile manufacturer if there's no wars. No point selling drugs if no one's sick. But when it comes to homelessness, we're still not quite as cynical as we need to be on that one. And yeah, she basically said, I don't know what to do. There's a tendency to support superficial interventions, but not substantial ones. Because substantial programs where, generally governments want to partner and put real money in and like buy buildings and accommodate people and help you and sort of crack the whip as well, require you to live there and not take drugs. And she's like, they don't like that. They don't like it because it's taking their job basically. And I should have been more cynical after writing a book like that, but I wasn't cynical enough. And I've sort of come to realize I've had meetings with people from church organizations.
Yeah.
Right. So the churches in Australia, probably the same in the UK, they're some of the biggest landowners, very, very wealthy. They don't pay land tax or any taxes, I think. And I had a meeting with someone and they said, oh, we've got all this land in great suburbs. We want to build some houses for people. What should we do? I'm like, well, have you hired an architect and planner and started like a builder? Oh, no. We want to partner with a joint venture with the government and they will rent our land office and pay us and they will organize everything and we'll just get free money. I'm like, you're a church that doesn't want to spend the money to house people.
Yeah.
You want to make money by orchestrating for the state to subsidize you.
Yeah.
To use your land to house people. Like, what is going on? And so now it's quite interesting. There's a big movement here to sort of upzone church land and give them these rights for free to sort of do all this housing when they can do it any day of the week. They just don't want to because they have to pay for it. They just want someone else to pay for them to look good. And I'm like, oh my God. Yeah, so that didn't make it in the book, but
yeah, the church isn't in the book.
Sort of a typical example.
Yeah, and it's worth saying, it's not it's not about the people who inhabit these organizations necessarily. I mean, one of them, the woman who sent you the email was working there and was disappointed, right? But it's just one of these organizational things where in order for the organization to exist, the problem has to continue to exist, right? And that's why they might surprisingly lobby against these solutions. And I just want to underscore again that, we said this last time in the podcast we did last time, the solution to many of the problems in housing, not all of them, but the solution really is low-cost housing, right? It's providing low-cost housing to people. It's not that clever or complicated. Obviously, there'll be details to iron out, and you need experts and everything. But in principle, that is just what will give people houses. Shockingly, low-cost housing. Give low-cost housing to people, then they'll have houses, right? That's it. But all of these organizations, whether they're the corporations or the charities, they don't like this simple solution because it doesn't extend the problem and it doesn't give them things to write about, and academics as well,
Yeah, there's an incentive for academics to find more niche issues to concern themselves with rather than the basic thing of, but there is a trick, right? It's not like it is simple in theory, but in practice, there is this human tendency to compare and to assess what's fair and what's not. So consider this situation, right? We go, oh, well, so we solve housing by giving people cheap housing. Okay, so we're going to build houses all in every suburb in the country, little projects everywhere. And if you don't own a house, you just rock up. And if you've lived in that city for 5 years, you qualify. If you don't own a house, you've lived there and you can afford to pay the subsidized price, you get it. Imagine if I live next door to one of those and I've just paid the full market price, and then you next door build a dozen houses that are 50% cheaper. And my mate or my brother or, gets to just rock up and live the identical lifestyle to me for 50% of the price. Why?
Yeah.
How is that fair, right?
Yeah.
So I think there is a rationing, the market rations by price, and we just all pretend it's fair. It's all stuck in our brains that, well, you paid the price, therefore that's the right thing to do, therefore it's fair. It's like the water we swim in as fish, right? We don't even see it because it's the default. And when we try and do something different, now it's tricky because I had to pay for that. And you didn't have to pay for that, right? Very, very awkward situation. So we need to also collectively come up with, well, how do we manage this, right? What sort of scale do we need? Because we know 2/3 of people own their own home. They're probably happy where they are and they've got their capital gains and they can relocate. We've also got to make this thing a worse investment if it's going to be cheaper, right? It can't be cheaper and give you all the capital gains. That's just such a huge amount. So we'll restrict resale. That's what I propose. That's what Singapore does. It's got a parallel. So you can only resell to someone who can qualify to be in the subsidized housing, and that anchors the price.
I think that's sensible, right? Because that means somebody can't just buy, you can't just flip it, right? You can't just go to the government, I need a low cost house, and then turn around and go to the estate agent and sell it at market price.
Cash in.
That's completely fair, I think.
Take a few $100,000, live in Thailand for 20 years. Yeah, exactly. So in Singapore, they have 5-year mandatory occupancy. If you sell it, you can't buy back in for a certain number of years. You can't also, I don't know if you can buy private property. So there's lots of restrictions, but they've trial and errored this process for 50 years, right? We just go and ask. And I've spoken to them many times and they go, oh, we learned this lesson. We don't do that anymore. We do this now.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's simple in practice, but the political persuasion to say this is fair is very difficult. Like if you consider, and in the book I talk about, public schools. Before public schools, it was like, well, you're just telling me you're going to pay for any kid to go to school and build schools everywhere, and you're going to take customers from the religious schools? Yes. But it was a hard sell, right? Yeah. Public health is a hard sell, right? You're basically saying, you want to send the private insurers broke by giving everyone basically discounted public insurance in hospitals? Yes, we do. How is that fair? Well, sorry, it's fair. You can still voluntarily overpay for private health insurance. We have this big problem in Australia. The public health system is actually quite good. So young people won't take any private health insurance in addition. They just do everything public. That's what my situation as well. Like my kids are almost finished school and I'm like, the public health system is so good. why would I pay $2,000 a year to to have extra insurance? So we actually penalize people after you earn a certain income if you don't have private insurance to sort of force people to sustain this market.
Mm.
Anyway, so I talk in the book a lot about the history of that and how hard it was and how the doctors actually lobbied against having public health
Yeah.
insurance because they're like, no, 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 you're going to only allow us to charge a regulated price. I want to, operate. I want to have my business in a fancy suburb where I can charge lots to these people. And you're saying, uh, you know, the next doctors in the public system are only going to be paid a salary. Oh, I don't know if that's fair.
Mm.
It was really hard. I mean, imagine today doctors lobbying against providing people cheap or free healthcare. But that's what they did. They did
Yeah.
it for decades.
Yeah. Yeah, and then once it becomes baked in, people just accept it, and obviously you've got something very similar with the NHS, where it's we love the NHS in the UK, at least in in theory. In practice, we kind of underfund it and mistreat the staff and stuff. But yeah, in principle, we love it, right? But yeah, I think it's just like, I guess you just need such a sustained political push to get this on the agenda, and then I think once it's on the agenda, it's just obvious to people, even if there might be a bit of animosity and some problems to iron out. But there are plenty of countries that have something like this. I mean, Finland is famous for doing it. I think Utah and a couple of American states have tried it, or cities, and Sweden, France have not a giveaway, but they have like a very strong mandate that you need low-cost housing if you're going to develop privately.
It's something like 25% in France, right?
Yeah, it's so high.
Subsidized housing.
They actually fine the people that don't do it as well. Like and it's just all of these things. And I think once people see that, it's good. Even from a really narrow, selfish perspective, it's good to have people who aren't fewer homeless people. It's good to have neighborhoods that have a variety of different people in them, not just sort of middle class yuppies or whatever. You know what I mean? Once they realize all these things, and once you develop these neighborhoods and these communities, then it's easier to defend. But getting it there in the first place is difficult, right?
Yeah, change is hard. You're right. Once it's entrenched, it's hard to undermine it. There are some good signs. So I'm talking about Queensland a lot because that's where I live, and there's a lot happening. And partly because we increased the royalties on coal and gas a couple of years ago, and so we got like $20 billion up our sleeves during the last mining boom that we wouldn't have had. And so the state's actually doing some interesting stuff. Not only are they building social housing very quickly, they're buying from the markets. For example, there was a retirement village that an institutional investor was trying to sell, a completely empty, fully built retirement village with like 100 apartments. So the state just bought it, painted it, fixed everything up, and just started taking people off. What we have this thing called the social housing waiting list, and just started taking people off. And then they bought an empty hotel that was for sale. Some hotel institution didn't want to own it anymore, so the state just bought it, tarted it up, and now there's 200 people living there off the social housing waiting list. So it's sort of been amazing. Literally in 2 years, thousands and thousands of houses are just sort of appearing because we actually want to do it.
Yeah.
And I think the difference is we want to do it now because this government has an election and they've got plenty of money from royalties. They're like, this is a good thing. It's going to get us back. So they change their mind, and all of a sudden, good things happen.
It's not a sort of Soviet-style complete socialization, is it, as well? This is the thing, right? It kind of underpins... I mean, in the same way that I would think of, basic healthcare and basic education as kind of underpinning activity in the private sector, or communities, or whatever. I would think of that kind of state intervention that's like the basic standard of living, the floor, right? That in other sectors, I think this is that for housing. So it's not,
it just holds everything up to a certain level.
Exactly.
And so you can go above it, go nuts, go and spend your money on being better than this.
It's not that radical at all, in my opinion.
I don't think it's radical. And what's interesting, and you would remember from the book, we had this famous liberal which is our sort of right-wing government, the sort of open markets side of politics. He's
Liberal
founded the
means
liberal.
something different to literally every individual, I think, at this stage. It's
Yeah,
so
yeah.
confusing, isn't
Yeah,
it?
every country has their own names, but
Yeah,
we'll
yeah.
call them the sort of more pro-market party.
Okay, okay.
And so his name's Robert Menzies. He was the prime minister twice, and he actually the second time had established the Liberal Party, right? His own party, and so he's thought of as the father of the political party. And yet his big, um, his big push, his big sort of success in his second term was building more public homes than the previous Labor government. Like he's saying, we're better than them because we're doing more socialism.
Yeah.
But he's like, oh, but it's not socialism. Actually, it's a special type of capitalism where we're creating little capitalists by subsidizing people into owning their home. So it's not socialism. I've just renamed it a special type of capitalism. I'm like, I don't care what you call it. That's great. You built 20,000 in 4 years. Keep going.
Yeah.
Right. So we've got this, we're talking here. It's like a safety net. It sets a minimum standard. It's not controversial. Fuck, just call it capitalism like he did. Let's create more capitalists.
Yeah,
subsidize people. It's this weird salesman's trick, right? What's that famous guy? The famous salesman in the US. Anyway, it's just
I don't know.
Anyway, it'll come to me. He's famous for sort of not Edward Bernays, maybe inventing
Bernays
propaganda.
Bernays was the advertising guy, right? Who was
No, there's another guy who's like a traveling circus guy who's famous in selling.
Maybe
things.
Chat
Anyway,
knows. Maybe Chat knows. Tell us.
Yeah, maybe. But it's a little bit like that, right? Like you can call anything. This whole socialism, capitalism doesn't matter. It's just like people who don't have houses, we should have systems there to get them into houses that are stable and below market. Like it's not. There's a lot of different implementations and institutions to do it. You can call it whatever you want, but this idea of tricking, property owners with a different tax that are going to suddenly flood the market and wipe $3 trillion off the value of every house in the country. Yeah, I just haven't seen that ever happen before.
Actually, okay, this is interesting because so I would class you broadly as very sympathetic to Georgism, right? And using its insights. But there is a little bit in the book that might upset the Georgists where you say, and this is what you were just hinting at, right? When you say replacing a stamp tax with a land tax, you don't think it will do that much for, house prices, the market, anyone really, except maybe property companies or maybe even nobody, maybe just nobody.
Oh, look, it's been a real weird thing that I don't know what it's like in the UK. So stamp duties in Australia are between 2% and 4%, basically. So if you buy $1 million house, you pay $35,000 in New South Wales to buy it. And we could have basically for the state government to put your name on the title and stamp it, right? It's cost you $35,000. Now, it's also true that the title system in Australia is insured. So if you actually go to the US, right, you have to buy titles insurance because someone can come along and claim, no, sorry, I didn't actually mean to sell it to the previous guy who sold it to you. I actually own this property still, right? So the title has to follow this chain. I think the UK is still like this. You've got to follow every step in the trade and make sure all trades are valid. In Australia, we have the Torrens title system, which basically says, if we put your name on the title, we guarantee it. If someone claims that they still own this and they win the claim, we will pay them for you. Okay, so you're 100% guaranteed as soon as your name's on the title. So in the US, for example, you might be paid when you buy a house between $2,000 and $6,000 in title insurance to make sure that if someone says, sorry, I actually own that house, that there's, you don't end up losing it, right? The title insurance company will pay them out. That's a random aside to just get to the point that stamp duty is basically it's a Tobin tax on trading property.
Yeah.
Right. So Tobin tax is like a trade on small percentage cut on trading an asset. And we know that if you tax trades, you get fewer trades, right? Because that's the margin that you can adjust on. But we also know that in terms of price, the incidence of the price is on the seller, right? So if you are willing to pay $1 million when there's let's make it a round number, 5% stamp duty. That means you're willing to pay 1,050,000 all in to own that asset, right? So if you remove the stamp duty, why are you now suddenly only willing to pay 1 million all in and not 1,050,000 all in? Well, you're not. You're still willing to pay 1,050,000, and so the seller gets that money, right? That wedge between the price and the market price and the after-tax price actually is incident on the seller. And we know this, everyone knows this, there's lots of research on this. So, and you can think about it, you're at a house auction. I don't know if you auction houses in the UK much, but it's the huge thing in Australia to sell houses by auction. And, you can have each bidder there at 1 million. Do I have another bid? Do I have another bid? And then suddenly someone hears on the radio, oh, no, you don't have to pay $50,000 stamp duty now. It's zero. Keep the auction going. And so you just bid up, right?
Yeah.
You save both bidders 50,000, so you bid it up, and now the seller gets it. So we know it doesn't make the all-in cost of buying cheaper. We know it makes the money you get from selling higher, and we know it increases turnover. And one of the forgotten parts of this is that turnover is not just owner-occupiers relocating. Turnover also includes investors selling their property with a tenant in it. And in Australia, the most common reason for a tenant to move is the landlord selling the home.
Right.
So people go, you're limiting moves by taxing stamp duty, right? Because owner-occupiers want to avoid paying taxes. It's costly to move every 5 years, right? It's 50,000 every 5 years or whatever. So they move less often. That's bad because mobility is good. Why is it good? It's not clear. No one's argued that why it's good, but it's apparently good. Fine. So if mobility that you want is good, is mobility that you don't want bad? So all those tenants, it's a third of the market are tenants who are moving much, much more frequently because landlords are selling and maybe spending $3,000 or $4,000 moving, new house deposits, clean up, everything else. Isn't that a cost? Should we acknowledge that? I don't know. So in New Zealand, there's no stamp duty, right? Zero. Costs you nothing. Do you know what? New Zealand has all the same issues in Australia. But, what's worse in New Zealand is that the main reason tenants move is because the landlord sells. Sorry, in Australia, that's not the main reason. It's like the third reason. So in New Zealand, that's a bigger problem because there's no stamp duty. And do you know what? They're having the exact debates about housing that we're having here. So that's the stamp duty part. And the other point is that when you buy a house, you by definition have lots of money and ability to get leverage because that's why you're buying a house. You're in a position where you've got that ability. So I call it a high liquidity event. And so you don't really notice. Yeah, it's a lot of money, but you don't notice because it's a small amount in this high liquidity event. A land tax that you pay every year or 4 times a year for the rest of your life often happens at low liquidity points in time, right? Like when you're retired and on the age pension. Right. And so I'm like, what difference does it make if you just pay this up front rather than an ongoing? I mean, there's an equivalence between a stream of payments and an upfront payment. Right. The present value of that stream is this.
Yeah.
They're economically equivalent. And what's funny is a lot of advocates say, get rid of stamp duty, make it a land tax. I'm like, okay, what about pensioners? Are we going to end up just subsidizing their land tax because they can't afford it? Oh, no. What we'll do is we'll accumulate it and charge it as a lump sum when they sell, when they eventually die or move out.
Right.
I'm like, you're telling me that you're going to accumulate this cash flow that was really important to become an annual cash flow and charge it as a lump sum on the sale of a house. And that is better than the system we have, which is a lump sum on the sale of a house.
Yeah.
You're basically getting us back to the same point for all the pensioners and then sort of annoying everyone else by not taxing at the high liquidity event, but on the ongoing basis. I mean, we in the ACT, where Canberra, Australia's capital is, they have now, they're about 14 years into a 20-year transition from stamp duty to land tax. So stamp duties are down by half, land taxes have doubled. They've actually realized, stamp duty is really good. We're going to keep it.
Yeah.
We're just going to keep it at 2.5% instead of 3.5%. And they've rolled in council rates and state or territory taxes into a single other tax. So essentially now they're totally funded by property taxes and stamp duties. and they're raising lots of money. Everything's great. But do you know what? Rents aren't cheap.
Yeah, yeah. So it's
Yeah.
still not working. No, that I mean that was really clearly explained, and it's about when you pay, right? The land tax is kind of continuous, whereas the stamp duty is you sort of during a windfall. So actually, for a lot of people, the land tax is much more troublesome. Is that right? That's sort of the key point,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, I don't like this debunking of land tax because I like I want to believe that
Well,
it's a really good policy. I mean, does it have positives? I mean, Nadeem asks, does it reduce speculation? Because I think don't you have a paper on this where you actually use the real options
yeah.
approach that we were
Yeah,
talking
yeah,
about at
yeah,
the
yeah,
beginning,
yeah,
and
yeah,
you said
yeah, yeah, yeah.
because the idea is you can't. I mean, it relates to land banking as well, right? You can't sit
It
on
does. It
it
does.
if you're a property developer. You can't sit on it because you're getting taxed
Correct.
every year, so it lights a fire under your feet, and you've got to get rid of it as a hot
Mm.
potato, or to mix various metaphors.
I do have a paper on that, and
Yeah,
I think intellectually I've moved on from that, and I've
right.
realized how many more issues I didn't even consider and totally avoided in that paper. And
Oh,
there are many. Like this is just so everyone's clear. When you're really trying to say and explain and model things that have never been done before, you're just making it up. You're doing your best to represent reality
yeah.
because you don't have anything to sort of anchor it on. And so that's what I was doing, and I was trying to keep it simple. And the land tax in that model is a little bit like it's sort of modeled as an increase in the interest rate, right?
Mm.
So it's an extra cost for waiting, giving up something else. But there's a few issues. There's quite a few issues with that. How do I start explaining it? I do have an article coming up on my Substack in a few weeks,
Okay.
fresheconomicthinking.com, where I get into why that's wrong and what the cutting edge of thinking is. But let me try and explain it. So you have, we're back to the absorption rate, right? And we're trying to stop speculation by accelerating housing supply, bringing tomorrow's production into today.
Yeah.
And the price of waiting is essentially what you're giving up in the interest rate, right? But if you add a land tax, it adds a cost to waiting. So because you don't pay the land tax if you build it and sell today, someone else does. However, I'm just not sure if I appropriately factored that into the price today as well as the price tomorrow, because the buyer already knows that they're paying that in the future as well. And I suspect that instead of making, so this is go today, this is wait, instead of making waiting worse, I actually think it makes both worse. It just brings
Right.
the same. And so the
Right.
intertemporal trade-off is relatively similar. And there's a few other reasons why that might be the case. And secondly, it matters in the cycle as well, right? Because when land values rise, they're like a leveraged bet on the price of housing, right? So they rise more than in proportion. So if the house price goes up 20% and land value is half of the price, right? And the construction cost is fixed, your land value actually rises 40%. So in the boom, it might be have a big effect, but then in a bust, it sort of slows you down, right? Because if next year's price is lower and things are falling, you're getting bailed out because your land value tax is going down, right? So it's sort of bailing you out in the cycle. And so the net effect of that, I don't really know either. So there's a couple of issues in the details. And, I'm happy to admit that that's not the perfect paper, but I think it advanced us so that we can now have this conversation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
With the framework of the intertemporal trade-off and how you model that appropriately. So I think where my mind is hovering at the moment is that there is an implementation effect, right? So there's a once-off effect of everything has to get repriced.
Mm-hmm.
And in that process, is there some bringing forward, right?
Yeah.
Maybe there is, right? So in Victoria, where Melbourne is, they've implemented a broader land tax in the last couple of years, and you're seeing a lot of people who are very patient going, oh, I got to cash out now because I don't want to pay it. Because, I'm not a liquid person. I bought this property because I wanted something that didn't cost me anything I could sit on. And now more liquid owners are purchasing those, and they're like, oh, okay, now there's a little bit of pressure to activate that land. So maybe there's a sort of transitional adjustment effect, but in terms of the long run, not so sure anymore.
Okay, that's really interesting. Maybe a one-off effect, and that would be consistent because that wasn't just a theoretical paper, right? You presented evidence, right, that it might have
I
worked, and
think,
that's
yeah,
that
yeah.
you're
So
capturing
that
that
paper,
effect.
I think that's why, yeah. Now, the more I reflect and the more I understand the theory,
Mm,
and the more I look at different cases of adjusting to land tax, the more I do feel like I'm just capturing that couple of years of adjustment.
mm,
It's essentially creates its own little boom, right? Because there's a lot more selling and trading in the market. And essentially, building a house is a trade,
yeah.
right? You swap cash and land for a different asset. And by loosening up that market, you do that. But then everyone realizes, but the price is now not going up as quick. I better slow down. I don't know how to model that right now. I don't
Yeah.
know how to test that, but that's where my thinking is currently.
It is where, I mean, this is just where theory meets reality, right? And where maybe an economic model meets the legal reality, because I think you have to face it as any type of economist. And Georgism is like, it's quite nice because it seems like a really good policy, and it probably is. Your camera's all right. Yeah,
Yeah,
it is. I think it's a fine policy. I don't think it's a bad policy.
yeah,
Maybe it has some good positive effects. Maybe it's a moral policy. Maybe there's a moral case for taxing land. Right, that was a big part of Henry George's writing. But
yeah.
I think the kind of any one neat trick to solve everything is bad. I think, and I when you get down to it in the way you were speaking about it and what you discuss in your book, and you're like, well, stamp duty in practice, when you work out the practicalities, it kind of ends up being really similar to a land tax. And then you realize
That's right.
you've made
Yeah,
these theoretical distinctions that are really relevant in an economic model, but in the legal messy reality, it's like, oh,
yeah,
I mean, I had, because I know people who run businesses, and they're like, well, VAT and corporation tax, I kind of pay them in the same way, in the end. And it's like, actually, it's the distinction isn't as clear cut as we'd like to think as economists when we're being clever about which exact tax is going to be the best and solve everything, right?
I think you're right, and economists call this general equilibrium effects, right? Like
Yeah.
everything adjusts and things wash out a lot,
Mm,
which is sort of always a good. It's good to understand that people adjust and things adjust, and you think you're having a big effect, but there are offsetting effects. I mean, that principle is pretty useful. Um, you know, we would definitely probably disagree with a lot of how it's used, but there's an insight there that I think is useful.
for sure, for sure.
So I think in housing, a lot of the time we don't know what we want, right? Some people want more houses, even if they're more expensive, right? So a lot of property developers go, no, more houses is better, right?
Mm.
Even if they're more expensive. Yeah, they've got to be more expensive if you want us to build them. I'm like, but is that the problem we're trying to solve? Or is it the problem we're trying to solve that there's a small cohort of 10 or 15% of people that keep getting squeezed out of their rental home? They're going to have to wait till much later in life to own anything. Is that the problem we're having? In which case we can try and solve that one, but we're not going to bring down the price of everyone's house or raise it or do anything else. So I think breaking the problem down helps because a lot of people get on board. You've probably heard land value tax will solve this. They're
Yes.
like, I
Yeah.
have my solution.
Yeah.
Every problem can be fixed because this is the solution to
Yeah.
problems rather than, okay, this is one problem. How do we solve it? And what are the trade-offs there? Stamp duty inhibits trades of relocations of owner occupiers. Okay. Should we have no stamp duty for owner occupiers, but stamp duty for landlords? Is that going to pass?
Mm.
We and our way through, and we realize that maybe that's not such a big problem that needs solving.
Yeah.
Maybe that's an imagined problem because owner occupiers move all the time in Australia. Um,
You know
and
that.
again, you can.
Sorry,
So
carry on.
anyway, no, I was just going to say, it's like the stamp duty becoming equivalent to a land tax. You can also reason through that it's sort of equivalent for capital gains tax sometimes as well.
Right. Right.
Because it's
Yeah.
incident on the seller, and most sellers have made a capital gain, but they've actually got it tax free because owning your own home it's tax free capital gain in Australia. So it's sort of getting some capital gains tax back, and then you're like, it's not that controversial that I would change it, but putting a different tax in place to raise that money would be more controversial. And that's what's happened in New South Wales. They're like, oh, we're going to do stamp duty for land tax. And then the next minute's, oh, we're just going to get rid of stamp duty.
Yeah.
I'm like, do you not have anything good you want to spend money on? Like, are you out of ideas?
Yeah. Because it raises a lot of revenue, stamp duty as well. This is one other thing you say. And it's like, if you want to fund the kind of things that we're talking about, right, then maybe that maybe it's better to think about that revenue raised and the purpose it's used for. Maybe that's a much more direct way to think about it.
I think that's right. Yeah. How else could we raise $40 billion in 1 year?
Yeah.
That is essentially uncontroversial outside of a few niche economists.
Yeah.
It's very tricky, right? I mean, we could tax. Australia's lucky because we can tax coal and iron ore and oil and gas.
Like Norway, they've got that. We had that as well, but the Conservatives also sold all of that off and not realizing that it was an asset. Going back to our previous theme,
that's so bizarre. Like, we definitely have improved on that in the last few years in Australia, which is good. And it's been great. So, Queensland, we boosted our coal royalty. Now we've just got upgrading every train station in the country and every hospital.
Yeah.
And multiple new hospitals. And it's like a next 10-year rollout, right? Funded because the price of coal went up. I'm like, that's a good thing.
Use it for those purposes. There was this paper that was released, and I think it might just be a working paper not too long ago. I forget the author, but it was basically they were a criminologist, and they were basically saying every criminologist knows that most interventions just don't work, and it doesn't matter. Do you remember this paper? It doesn't matter if you're a tough on crime conservative. You're like, increase the number of police, raise prison sentences. It doesn't matter if you're a rehabilitating liberal, right? It just seems like a lot of these tweaks we make, they don't work. And I do think that when we're talking about a lot of these tax policies, and not everything, right? A lot of these tax policies, it's very technocratic, and it goes back to the academic stuff you were talking about, right? It's good to write a paper about to make a contribution, but that contribution is often very small, incremental, and theoretical. Yeah. And the bottom line is, and I stress, we're not like do nothing guys. We're not like people can't be helped. I think that the bottom line is, if you want to help people, do it directly, right? With a house. And that's the only thing that consistently seems to work.
That you're spot on, and I think we've both come to this conclusion through a lot of reading and learning and unlearning economics. My master's degree was on can individual behavior change all add up to having big effects on greenhouse gas emissions, right? If I ride my bike instead of drive my car, and then you realize, you know what, none of that adds up. The way to do it is to stop burning coal and do something else. Yeah. We should just do that. And if we have to subsidize someone, if we do public-private partnerships, if we have to compensate people, fine. Yeah. But the further away you go from just directly doing it, the less and less benefit you get. It's the same with public health, right? You can do all sorts of tax incentives. And I do find it, there's a sort of social status game in economics of, the more I can make a small tax tweak or regulatory change appear like it gets leveraged up through the economy to make everything better, the smarter I am. Whereas in reality, small tax changes, small revenue changes, small behavior changes, right? Exactly. I wonder if we could come up with a line. What did you say? Most criminal interventions don't work.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, most economic interventions don't work.
Most economic interventions don't work, yeah. And I think, you've seen this in behavioral economics as well, right, which is my field, just with a lot of the meta-analyses of nudge that have come out, have just shown that nudges, small, which for anyone who doesn't know, are like kind of changing the environment that people are making a choice in, with a label change, putting the fruit at the till instead of sweets, that kind of thing. Some of them do work, and I think it's probably good to think about behavioral economics when you're designing any policy. It's a good input, but at the end of the day, this one neat trick, again, most of them don't work. Some of them backfire. It's just these clever interventions are not really so clever.
Yeah, I think this is the problem, right? There's an aversion in economics to um, what do you call it? This is almost an aversion to intervention or um, anytime a public agency or even if it's a public-private partnership or there's some sort of political direction to an institution, economists just lose their heads and they can't think
Yeah.
about it. It's too hard. They're very averse to building up state capacity, building up institutions. You know, they're very good on corruption often,
Yeah.
but this building up capacity stuff, they're like, nah, no, there's got to be a tax trick because I'm going to use the magic of market forces that may not even exist in that area, right? Rather than, hey, imagine public schools, right? I think public schools are pretty uncontroversial that there's a huge collective benefit, from in the turn of the 20th century, right?
Oh
Huge.
no, sorry.
Yet that
Okay.
required a huge amount of capacity building, right? New institutions, everything's unpriced. How
Yeah.
do we manage this?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, don't know. It's a weird one, these
That
economists.
I completely agree. I have to say there was a bit of a technical glitch, and I don't know. For me, your sound cut out. Now I think there's like a delay and stuff, so I don't know what it's like for people watching. But there's maybe a bit. Our mouths aren't moving at the right time, or we might have to be a bit patient and make sure we know that the other one's finished speaking because it's gone a bit weird. By the way, but yeah, absolutely. On the institution building and direct provision, I think is really important. The salesman, by the way, was P.T. Barnum, I think. Is that the guy you're
P.T.
talking
Barnum,
about?
thank you, chat. Thank you,
Yeah,
P.T.
yeah, yeah.
Barnum.
Thanks, chat. Yeah, Asger and Jeff helped with that. Yeah. So
Great job.
someone says he said the name of the channel. Yes. Okay, good. I think
Right.
we might leave it there
Yeah.
because we've been talking for almost 2 hours and I don't want to abuse people's time too much. This isn't Joe Rogan. So, but I mean, it's been really interesting and we went down this path of this unexpected path of, whether interventions work and stuff, which I wasn't sort of planning. I didn't have that in the questions. So it's been great. But do you want to sort of do a final plug, for your book and everything
mate.
else? Yeah, there it is. Hey, I've also got it.
You got it.
Hold it up.
Final plug. Yeah, I mean, the
Yeah.
book. As soon as you finish writing anything, you realize how imperfect it is. But do you know what? I had a crack, and I think it's given us the language, the equilibria, the absorption rate, the trade-offs. It's given us the tools and the ideas and the insights and the analogies to progress the conversation much, much further than anyone else. And that's what I really think the book is for. It's like my attempt to sort of push us to a better conversation rather than the same old, developers don't like taxes that are incident on property. No doubt they don't. Those insights like the homelessness organizations don't always know how to solve homelessness. You've got to learn from what's worked elsewhere and really, maintain a degree of skepticism. And that's true for those tax tricks as well. So that's the book. For those who don't know me, I write at fresheconomicthinking.com every Sunday night, a sort of in-depth article on some big ideas in economics that I think are useful and insightful. Yeah. So that's where you find me. And on Twitter, I'm at Dr. Cameron Murray, DrCameron, Murray, Murray. And you can reach out on LinkedIn as well.
Yeah, okay. Did you mention the YouTube channel? Sorry, that you do have a YouTube channel.
I have a YouTube channel. What's it called? Don't know. Fresh Economic Thinking.
I think it's just called Fresh Economic Thinking. It's actually linked in the description. So yeah.
Yeah, great. And so I just put up presentations and speeches that I do just to have it there, right? Because
it's every time for people.
Every time I do a speech or presentation, I'm trying to share some new insight that I've got that I think is really helpful for us to all have to have a better conversation about housing or economics in general.
So I completely agree with your interpretation of your book, and it's actually what I got out of it, regardless of the exact policies you draw from it and conclusions you draw from it. It's the framework and applying it consistently that moves the conversation forward, and allows us to think about housing beyond kind of economics 101 brain rot that everybody seems to have, and that might change our conclusions or it might not, but I find it valuable that somebody's actually not just using a bloody demand and supply diagram.
You saw I had a go at that in the book, right, Carl? It's just like, as I say, if people say it's demand and supply, right? Demand, that has a specific meaning in economics. It just means buyers and sellers. It doesn't tell you why. No. Buyers willing to buy and a seller's willing to sell.
No.
And you almost may as well say, well, what causes house prices is the people writing the number of the price on the contract, right? It's got that much information, right? It doesn't tell you why.
Yeah.
Of course, when we trade, buyers and sellers set prices. Like, of course. Don't be silly. But, by substituting an economic term, we feel like it explains something rather than just describes something.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. That's a good place to end. That's a good place to end, though, because that's it, basically. But anyway, Cameron, thank you so much for coming on the podcast again. It was really great to speak to you, and I do recommend the Great Housing Hijack for anyone trying to understand the housing market.
Great. Thanks for having me again, Kahal. Talk to you later.